So I'm here to talk to you guys about cultivating conservation and how we can bring more conservation on farms without negatively impacting their bottom lines. But before I started, I thought I would do a land acknowledgement. The Stewardship Society works from Soyuz all the way up to Enderby, Princeton over to Cherryville. So we work on the unceded lands of both the Syilx and the Pemic peoples, who are the original stewards of this land. The Stewardship Society works in sort of three main pillars, and they all kind of blend together to make our program. So the first of our sort of programs is the Wildlife Habitat Steward Program. So these are landowners and land managers who they sign a written management agreement for their properties. They all have wildlife habitat on their properties, and they sign a written management agreement to say that they will help to care for that habitat. We currently have 133 stewards who have written management agreements, and they are taking care of 9,400 acres. And a lot of those people are farmers. They're not all farmers, but they do have businesses that are land-based, or they're just people who own a bunch of fantastic land. So you can be a steward and also a farmer, or run a B&B, or have a golf course. We have a couple golf courses as stewards. Our second sort of pillar of stewardship is community stewardship, so that's things like education and outreach, so things like the talk today, but it also sort of blends together into our restoration activities. So you can see there's a garbage pick there, and some people with shovels here and over here, so those are people who are coming out and helping with hands-on restoration projects. We also do some outreach where it has like an immediate, walk on the land component, or we do a beginner birding workshop where we teach people about what to look for if you're starting birding and how to tell birds apart, and then we go out and look for birds. And then that last piece was the restoration. So this is hands-on work. We do planting, we do native or invasive plant control. This is a project that I'll talk a little bit more about later, but it's a couple of our summer students, and they're removing wire from a vineyard. So over the 10 years that the Okanagan Similkameen Stewardship Society has been in existence, we've planted 29,000 native plants, and we've removed 14,000 kilograms of garbage and invasive plants from habitats around the Okanagan and Similkameen. And that is only the invasive plants that are flowering or have gone to seed, because a lot of the time, if we're not worried that the invasive plants are going to self-seed, we'll just leave them to compost on site. So we've actually removed a lot more invasive plants than that, but those are the ones that we bagged up and took to the landfill. So why the Okanagan Similkameen? This is a heat map of a distribution of different species at risk. So if you see yellow, that's sort of the range of one single species at risk, and as more species are being piled on top of each other, you get into the oranges and into the reds. And what you can see from this map is that our little valley is sort of the darkest, reddest patch in all of BC. So we do have an incredible number of species at risk. We have a unique climate here. We're sort of the northern tip of the Great Basin desert. And so we have some species that just barely come up into Canada. The only place they're found in Canada is in the Okanagan Valley, which is of course also a fantastic place to live and a great place to grow grapes. And so there's a lot of pressures that are all happening together on the land here. So why private land and why farms in particular? In the Okanagan and Similkameen, 30% of the valley bottoms are either owned or privately owned or privately managed. So that's a big piece of the pie that is privately owned and managed. And everybody wants to live close to water. So that's not just people, but it's also our wildlife, and particularly our species at risk tend to be down at the valley bottom where everyone's concentrated. So in order for both to keep common species common and also to try and preserve some of these endangered species, we have to try and conserve as much of those habitats that are left as we can. We also have some of the highest prices of land in Canada, and particularly agricultural land is very valuable in the Okanagan Valley, which means that buying everything that is of conservation value just isn't practical. So there are really great organizations, and I'm not trying to say that they're not fantastic, like the Nature Trust and the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and they buy parcels and they hold on to them for conservation forever, and it's great. But there's just so much need, and land is so expensive, that getting landowners to voluntarily maintain some wildlife habitat on their own properties is sort of key to making this whole thing work. And especially because we're so concentrated in the valley bottom that if wildlife wants to make it from the east side of the valley to the west side of the valley, or north and south along the valley, you really need to go through some of that private land. So having those safe spaces for wildlife to move through the valley is really important. Agricultural land, the Agricultural Land Reserve accounts for about 5% of the land within BC, but it's more heavily concentrated in the south. And so within the city of Kelowna, 38% of the city of Kelowna is actually Agricultural Land Reserve, 15% in the regional district of the Okanagan and Similkameen, and 30% in the district of Summerland. So again, this is a major land use in the Okanagan and Similkameen is farming, which, I mean, all of you know just by driving around. And farmers have a really hard job. I mean, they feed us, which is great. They're really subject to the whims of the weather, and a lot of you have probably heard that the latest cold snap was really detrimental to the wine industry. So trying to add one more thing that we're expecting them to do, not just to feed us, but also to try and be champions of conservation can be a little bit hard to swallow. But what we're trying to promote here are that there are some things that people can do that can be beneficial to conservation without being harmful to farms. So that's sort of what we're trying to talk about, is how conservation and agriculture don't necessarily have to butt heads. They can work together a little bit. So over the past 30, 40 years, there's been a large shift in agriculture in the Okanagan Valley. In the 1990s, beginning of the 90s, there were only 12 wineries in all of the Okanagan, or all of the South Okanagan, and 1,500 acres of grapes, which it's still a big number, but now we're up to 222 wineries and over 10,000 acres that are planted into grapes. So that's a big change in land use, and a lot of that was converted from orchard. Some of it was converted from natural lands. But even within the orchards, there's been a big shift. So, you know, if you think orchard, this is kind of the traditional old orchards with big trees. And there's been a real shift towards these high-intensity orchards with dwarfing rootstock. And so there's just, they're great for farmers because you can get more yield off of smaller parcels of land, but it does leave less room for wildlife. So you've got a big tree, there's lots of room in it for birds to nest. Lots of the old orchards were not deer fenced. Deer could wander through without causing a lot of damage because the fruit was higher up. So all of these deer fences have gone in. And I don't want to paint too rosy a picture because, you know, a lot of these orchards were sprayed pretty heavily with DDT. So there's definitely some steps forward that we've made, but not everything has been a step forward, at least in terms of wildlife and conservation. So I sort of struggled about whether or not I should include this picture in here. It sort of fits, it sort of doesn't. So this is a Soyuz in 1928. And this is a recent photo, aerial photo taken from Google Earth. And what you can see is that 100 years ago, there wasn't really a Soyuz in a Soyuz, right? Like, there's not really any sign that there's people living there. There's a couple of roads, and that's about it. So one of the things that we talk about a little bit in conservation is shifting baselines, which is that every generation sort of thinks what they grew up with is normal. And so we are in this very short snapshot of time right now, and industrial agriculture is sort of thriving and booming, but there are other ways to do things. And it's just something to think about, that maybe we don't have everything quite all figured out. And I guess the other thing that I wanted to talk about here is that if you put a parking lot over a plant, that plant is gone. But if you put a parking lot over, say, snake habitat, it's possible that the snakes will move and they'll just be in a slow population decline. So it's possible that we haven't actually seen all of the impacts that are happening from this yet, because they're cumulative and they're slowly building on themselves. Okay, so in terms of bringing conservation onto farmland, what we're using is something called nature-based solutions, which the IUCN defines as being leveraging nature and the power of healthy ecosystems to protect people, optimize infrastructure, and safeguard a stable and biodiverse future. It's basically just trying to use natural processes to help ourselves, which is something that humanity has been doing for basically the entire course of human history and prehistory. So some examples, and I'm starting with a big one. So some of these things are very difficult to do, and some of them are quite a bit easier to do. This is a big, difficult one, but it is such a cool project. So I told you that the Stewardship Society is only 10 years old, but it grew out of the South Okanagan Stewardship Program, so SOS Stewardship, and this was done in 2009, so it was actually done before Stewardship was its own society. The Campbell family bought this property. It was entirely covered in orchard. The previous owners had filled in a wetland, and the Campbells wanted to re-excavate the wetland. One of the things that makes this sort of a unique win-win situation is that their orchard is planted to cherries, and cherries are particularly susceptible to frost in the early season. So when they start to bloom, if they get hit by a frost before their flowers have been pollinated, the flowers will fall off the trees and they won't set fruit that year. And because this was a depression, what happens is that cold air sort of builds up in there in the early spring. So it was what's called a frost pocket. And by putting a pond in there, they've added kind of a thermal buffer. So that helped to keep that whole area warmer. So the air in that frost pocket has kept it from freezing. The other thing is, because there was a wetland there that was filled in, it was quite damp, and it wasn't actually great soil for farming. So these guys actually removed trees from production, or removed areas from production, and ended up with higher yields because of this project. So it's a little hard to see. You can't really see that there is a pond here, just because it's grown up so well. So this is taken from Google Earth. This is in 2008, and you can see just orchard. And this is 2010, and all of a sudden there's a pond there. And this is the most recent Google Earth image, which I think is from 2001, which shows how well those trees and shrubs have grown up. So the Cambos got, for their farm, they got frost protection. They created habitat for native pollinators, so it helped to decrease their reliance on European honeybees. And they created habitat for predatory or for beneficial wildlife, so things like predatory insects, birds, bats, all kinds of things that will eat some of the insects that are pests on their orchard. And in terms of the environment, these valley bottom wetlands are extremely threatened. We've lost 85% of our valley bottom wetlands. So just recreating one of those is incredibly valuable. And it's adding to the biodiversity of the region as well. So this is a livestock exclusion fence with a rancher. What you can see here is they have left what's called a nose in. So it's just a really narrow little V so that their livestock can still get into the creek to get water. That can be important if you're in an area where it's really hard to, like, you don't have power and it's hard to set up a pump to have off-site watering. And it limits the area where the livestock are trampling the shore to a very narrow band. For the farm, it reduces soil loss and erosion to have the exclusion fence, but also the planting there. It is creating pollinator habitat, which isn't super important on a ranch, but if you've got a mixed farm, it can be very important. And it reduces injury risk and reduces contact to water, and so it can reduce some waterborne illnesses. And for the environment, it reduces pollution because it's keeping those animals out of the creek. And all of those trees and shrubs that are growing up are acting as a buffer and a filter for water that's running off along the surface and into the creek. And it's habitat for all kinds of wildlife, as well as creating shade for the creek, which is really, really important for fish. So particularly our salmon and other salmonids, they need cool water. And so if you've got a bare wide open creek, the sun hits the creek and it raises the temperature, and that lowers the amount of available oxygen, and it's just pretty detrimental all around to some of our fish species. So this was a big project and kind of an unusual one, although my next project is very similar. So the Okanagan Crush Pad bought a property they call the Garnet Valley Ranch, and the previous owners had had a hay field beside a creek. And wine grapes don't actually grow very well if they have too much moisture, or they don't produce high quality grapes. I think the problem is that the grapes grow too well if they have too much moisture, and the plants grow too well and the fruits don't grow enough. So they had this hayfield area that they weren't sure what to do with, and we helped them to try and restore it back into riparian forest. So for the farm, this is a decrease in maintenance because this is an area that was previously hayed. It wasn't producing super high quality hay, but then you need to have a tractor and a baler and all of that equipment to be able to continue haying it. So this is now an area where they don't have to worry about maintenance at all. There's an increase again in pollinators and predatory insects. I know pollinators aren't super important for grapes, but it's still great to have. And the other fantastic thing about this is just publicity. So you're trying to stand out against other vineyards. There's lots of people going organic. So what's your niche? How are you going to stand out? And I think this is a pretty fantastic way to stand out. In terms of the environment, one of the fantastic things about this particular project is that it is active floodplain. And we did see it flood in those big flood years of, I think it was 2016, 2017. So by having that active floodplain that is still in use or usable, the creek floods its banks, comes over and settles on this huge area, which allows it to slow down. It gives the water a chance to sink into the groundwater, so potentially you're losing some of the volume from the creek that way. You're also potentially losing some of the volume from evapotranspiration. So all of those trees and shrubs are pulling water out of the ground and then releasing it, some of it into the air through their leaves. So that's also helpful. But just having that big area for the water to sit in reduces some of the pressure downstream as well. Okay, I did say the next one was going to be very similar. So this is the vineyard owner, or the vineyard manager from Mount Boucherie actually came out to a talk that we had at the crush pad property and said, how big are you guys willing to go? And so they had just bought a property which had been planted in grapes at one point. It had the posts and the wire, and then it had been left, and almost all of the vines were dead. It is on the Similkameen side of the dike in Coston. And so there was a concern that it was going to be too wet once again to grow really high quality grapes. And so it's hard to see in the after that we have planted anything because it's an 11-acre field. So we did plant quite a few plants in there, several thousand, but several thousand in 11 acres doesn't look like much. Hopefully in the next few years this will bush out and look more amazing. The other really cool thing about this is that there was deer fencing all around this portion of the property, which was removed as part of this project. So there is an increase in habitat for ungulates as well as other animals. So on a smaller scale, you can just do hedgerows. So a hedgerow is just, a single row of, well, it's usually a couple of rows of trees or shrubs. This one's going to be a little bit bigger than that. If you guys ever are down at the farmers markets on Saturday in Penticton and you see the Schneider Browns, this is one of their farms. So the benefit to the farms is shade, which may be a benefit or it might not be depending on what you're trying to grow. But it also provides a windbreak, which helps to break up our hot, dry winds and leads to less moisture loss from the plants. So it can reduce drought stress. And again, it's providing habitat for all of those pollinators and other beneficial wildlife. So, okay, that is a valid question. This is a hedgerow that we have literally just planted. So all of these little white tubes are Volgards, and they're all around brand new planted trees. So a hedgerow, once it's mature, looks sort of like this. This was done, I think, a couple years ago, and it sort of has similar problems to that Boucherie project, that it's just getting started and starting to grow, so we don't have really very good after pictures yet, but we hope to in the future. So this is hopefully what it'll look like in 10 to 15 years. Some of those trees that's more than 15 years, but This is sort of a bit of a counterintuitive situation, because everybody talks about growing trees and planting trees as it's something that's fantastic for nature. But actually, in our area, one of the things that can be helpful for nature is taking out some trees. So we did do a project with a ranch, but he would prefer to remain anonymous. So I don't have a name associated with this one, but we have done a couple of thinning projects. So what you can see in the before picture, sort of, is that there's almost a monoculture. There's almost nothing here except ponderosa pine. The ponderosa pine isn't very happy. It's very thin, sort of toothpicky trees. Underneath, all that you have is pine needles. Well, there's a little bit of snowberry over here that's not very happy. So historically, there was a fire interval in the Okanagan of about every 7 years. The First Nations people would set fires to create better habitat for ungulates and to help promote the growth of berry bushes. And also, any fires started by lightning weren't put out immediately, which resulted in a more open forest. So this is what we call an open ponderosa parkland. You can see the benefit to ranchers is that there's a lot more food for cattle here than here, but there's a lot more food for everything else too. The trees are actually healthier because they're not competing as much with one another. So they're growing bigger and stronger. They actually have more branches, which provides more habitat for birds, and they create more pine cones, which is more food for birds and squirrels and all sorts of things. And then down here we've got grass, we've got forbs and wildflowers. Unfortunately, thinning projects like this are very difficult on Crown land because there's rules about if you cut down trees, you need to replant with a certain number of trees, and it's all based in forestry and it's so that, you know, once you log something in 100 years, you'll be able to log it again, but we don't want to be able to log it again here. So this also provides a fire break. So it also acts, although you can get a fire going through it, it's a grass fire, they move fairly quickly, it's unlikely to get up into the canopy. It doesn't tend to burn as hot as a traditional forest fire, so it's less likely to do damage to human structures. It's not impossible for it to do damage to human structures, but it's less likely. And it's less likely to damage the roots of the plants and the soil. So when you get a really, really hot fire, you can actually sterilize the soil, and it's really difficult to get plants to reestablish. So this kind of ecosystem is actually it's evolved to handle fire. So for fire to go through, it will regenerate on its own. Okay, so some of the easier things to do. Cover crops. So you don't see a lot of vineyards in the Okanagan looking like this, but it is sometimes practiced, sort of keeping vineyards almost sterile. And so this is a project, this particular after photo is from a project that's run by Rhonda Milliken, who's a professor out of SFU, and she's working with a few local wineries to try planting native crops under vines in vineyards. So here we've got a couple of native plants with these little bamboo skewers so that you can see them. This one is pasture sage, and I think this one is parsnip flower buckwheat. It's early on, so we don't have a lot of results. But cover crops have kind of been used historically because we didn't have a lot of ways of maintaining sterile vineyards, but it's sort of becoming more of an exact science. So people are doing a lot of work on exactly which plant species are most beneficial, and this work using native species is really new. Cover crops can help in farms in a number of ways. They've got a long history in sort of vegetable and root crops because it's easy to incorporate them as sort of a step. So you plant your crop, and then you have a fallow strip, and then you have another crop, and you rotate your crop. In these systems where you're not plowing things under, it's sort of a newer, I think, idea. In general, cover crops improve your soil health. They increase the amount of organic matter in the soil. So organic matter in the soil does quite a number of things, and all of them are important for plant health. So they improve the structure of the soil. They increase the ability of the soil to hold water. They increase the availability of nutrients to plants in the soil. And with grapes, you have to be a little bit careful about how much nitrogen you have, because if you have too much nitrogen, then the plant grows too well and it doesn't put as much energy into the grapes. So you've got a couple of options where you can grow grasses, which are going to be a high carbon, low nitrogen, or you can grow legumes, which actually fix atmospheric nitrogen and make more nitrogen available to plants. And the great thing about growing legumes is that it reduces the need for synthetic fertilizers. And synthetic fertilizers are very water soluble. So nitrogen is very important for plants, but it also is really important for algae. So if you put too much nitrogen, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, well, any kind of nitrogen fertilizer on your crop, and some of it gets down into the water, it can create an algae bloom. And the algae bloom can actually get so intense that the algae can use up all the available oxygen in the water and lead to fish die-offs. So there's been a fair bit of news about that, kind of in the Gulf of Mexico. Down near Texas, there's a big spot where there's eutrophication, but it happens in smaller waterways as well. In terms of for the environment, I mean, having native plants is fantastic in and of itself. Lots of cover crops include flowers for pollinators. Just having plants there means that you have more insect diversity. There's more things for insects to eat other than the grapevines, so that you have more insect diversity, and insects are the bottom of the food web. So it's very important for wildlife. So this is an example from Fresh Valley Farms, and they're a steward with us. They're up in Armstrong, and they've started to do no-till farming, sort of the more traditional way to prepare your fields is to, after you harvest them, you plow them up. No-till farming is relatively new, and it's using what's called a seed drill, and you just seed through the remnants of your last crop. And it means that you don't have to disturb the soil as much. You again get more organic matter accruing in the soil. You also get more carbon sequestered in the soil, so it doesn't release as much carbon into the atmosphere. And it improves water quality, and it can improve air quality too, because if you get wind after you've plowed a farm like this, then you get a lot of dust. So at its simplest, nature-based solutions: plant a tree. Just plant a tree somewhere where you want shade. Plant a tree by your house. Plant a tree where you have lunch. Maybe don't plant a tree in the middle of your field of crops, because you might need full sun. But it's creating habitat, and we would prefer if you planted native trees, but ornamental trees have a place too. So this is not a nature-based solution, but it is another initiative that our society puts on, which is industry outreach. We do no-cost visits out to farms to do snake safety training. This is because there are still some people out there who are really afraid of snakes, and there's some people that they'll swerve to hit a snake if they see it on the side of the road. The reason that we're particularly targeting the agricultural industry is that a lot of the migrant farm workers come from countries that have more venomous snakes and less protection for snakes. So our snakes are actually protected under federal law, but that doesn't mean that in the middle of a vineyard with no one looking, they're not gonna be killed when people find them. So this is a program to make people feel safer about snakes, and we do train certain individuals on how to move snakes if you need to, because it's not a great solution, but it's a lot better of a solution than killing the snake. And there are farm crews that are so afraid of snakes that if they see a snake, they will walk off the property for the day, and they won't come back until the snake is dealt with. So that kind of education and outreach is really important. And so then I just want to thank our funders, the South Okanagan Conservation Fund, which is through the RDOS, the Sitka Foundation, Habitat Conservation Trust Fund, and Environment Canada. And then if anyone has any questions. The comment is that Tom Lowry, who is a researcher up at the Summerland Research Station, has done some work with cover crops in vineyards and found that the cover crops are a host for beneficial predatory insects. So vineyards that are either next to natural areas or that do have cover crops have less need for pesticides because they have those beneficial insects helping them out. Okay, so the first part of the question is if we belong to any of the larger organizing bodies like the IUCN, and the answer is not sort of, but not really. So we're just a local nonprofit, and we get money from the federal government. We get money from some of these groups, but that's about it. And we get information from these larger groups as well, but most of that's just what's publicly available. And then in terms of working together with landowners, our organization has project funding. Landowners do need to bring a match to that funding. It doesn't necessarily need to be 100% financial match. So they can provide match funding by, if we're planting trees, they're watering trees. They're weeding around the trees until they're big enough that they can compete by themselves. So sometimes some of that can be an in-kind match instead of monetary. And we're limited on how much funding we have, so we can't do all the projects that we'd like to do. But yeah, we sort of bring like a little pot of money to be able to do certain projects with different landowners. Okay, so the question was, is there any plan for the federal or provincial governments to incentivize restoration through tax breaks or tax credits? The provincial government just looked at doing something like that. And my understanding is that they decided it was a little bit complicated, and they've given money to a few different stewardship groups to provide money directly to specific owners of parcels who are doing stewardship work. I don't love that model because I sort of think that everybody who's doing the work should be rewarded evenly, and it shouldn't be, you know, some landowners are getting rewarded for doing this work and other landowners aren't, just based on, you know, who knows about it. So I would love to see more tax breaks and incentives. I know that Ontario does have some programs to do tax breaks, so it is available other places. Not here yet, but hopefully yet. So the question was, where do we source our native plants and trees? We get most of our native plants from Sagebrush Nursery down in Oliver. And we get some from Zen, which is the Xeriscape Endemic Nursery in West Kelowna. Yeah, it can be hard to find them. Yeah. Okay, the question was, are we doing any projects where we're giving creeks more space? And the answer is that we're not. We would kind of like to, but it's really complicated in terms of permits. So we've sort of left that to ONA to do things, you know, in the water. So that's the Okanagan Nation Alliance. They're doing fantastic floodplain re-engagement stuff. And we've sort of left that to them because it's just a bit too big for us to bite off. So our particular stewardship program, we work with owners of larger parcels, but that doesn't mean you can't be a steward. There's a lot of information online if you look up habitat gardening. So really, native plants are fantastic. So incorporating native plants into your gardens. Water is super important. So if you have like a little wildlife pond, and don't put fish in it. Don't put fish in it. It's really great. And things that maybe your neighbors won't like, you know, if you've got in the back of your place somewhere that you can have a messy bunch of branches that are stacked together, it makes a great place for things to hide, right? Or even just sort of like, don't trim your shrubbery, don't tidy it too much, because all of that kind of complexity and messiness is super helpful for our wildlife. So in case anyone missed that, Sagebrush does go out and collect their native plant seeds very locally. So they'll go out. I've brought them bear scat before, and they'll grow the seeds out of the bear scat. It's a great way of getting chokecherry seeds. But sometimes you do get things like yarrow is a native plant, but there's also garden cultivars, and so you can even going in with a species name, you can get not exactly our native yarrow, or mock orange is kind of the same. That there's a bunch of different ornamental mock oranges.
What's anybody doing about invasive species of vegetation, like weeds or whatever you want to call it?
All right, the question was, what are people doing about invasive species? And that is a great question that you can ask Lisa Scott on March 26th. Lisa Scott runs the Okanagan and Similkameen Invasive Species Society. And so she is sort of the expert in the region on invasive plants. Our group does also work with private landowners on invasive plants. It's really a plant-by-plant basis, and some plants are easier to make headway against than others. So there are some species that they've found biocontrols for. So like knapweed used to be a really big problem, and they've released a whole bunch of different kinds of bugs, and there's still knapweed out there for sure, but it's not really the same kind of problem as it was 20 years ago. But then there's other new species that are coming in too, so it's a constant battle. Yeah, Tree of Heaven, there's really not a lot that can be done with Tree of Heaven without using herbicides, because it's so vigorous. Yeah. Okay, so the question was, is thinning something that we're looking to expand more into, I guess. And it's a fantastic project, but it's really, really expensive. So we don't really have the funding for it. There's a fantastic group in the Kootenays, that's the Kootenays Ecological Trench Society, and they're doing a ton of thinning and prescribed burns afterwards. And I would love for someone else to come here and do that. It's a bit of mission creep for us, but you know, if anyone's looking for a project and wants to start that here, that'd be great. I think there will be, and I think there is sort of some more money coming out to help with that kind of project, mostly from the fire perspective, but it's not quite here yet, I don't think. Okay, so I said earlier that if you have a wildlife pond, not to stock it with fish, and does that mean any fish? Really, goldfish are the fish that I'm talking about, but I would recommend against stocking with any non-native fish. Historically, the Okanagan and Similkameen had a lot of fish-free wetlands. So we had oxbows that used to be part of the river that got cut off, and some of those would have fish and some of them wouldn't. These little kettle ponds that didn't have fish. And so lots of our amphibians, and particularly spadefoots, which are a little frog-like amphibian. They're not a frog and they're not a toad. They're their own spadefoot thing right in the middle. And they need fish-free wetlands to thrive. And goldfish are actually becoming a problem in some of our bigger lakes. So up in Twin Lakes, it's not great fishing anymore because of all the goldfish. And they're bottom feeders, so they really stir up all of the sediments. They really reduce water quality. And they're able to gulp little gulps of air. So all of that sediment reduces the amount of oxygen in the water, and the goldfish can gulp some air to get more oxygen, but a lot of our other wildlife can't. So mostly it's for our amphibians, spadefoots, tiger salamanders, or little long-toed salamanders. If you've got a garden pond that's got really straight edges and it's like straight up and down, you're probably not going to get amphibians in it anyway. You might get some chorus frogs in there. But without emergent vegetation, it's not really a wildlife pond anyway. So if you have a specific koi pond, but there's people who are, they think it's the most natural solution to mosquito control is to, throw some goldfish out in the oxbows in their backyard, and that's really detrimental to all of the other things that want to live there. So dragonflies and damselflies have aquatic larvae, and they're absolutely voracious. So yeah, they will take care of some of the mosquito problems, but if you're finding there's mosquito problems, the mosquito pellets are really more environmentally friendly than releasing fish into these wetlands. So the question is, do we do migration work with vineyards? There's other organizations that are sort of better suited to look at corridors. So those big, we're really a carrot, not a stick. So we work with people who want to work with us, which is great. It's we're going in as like, yay, we're friends. Let's do fun things together. Whereas like a lot of times as an environmental consultant, you're kind of going in as the bad guy and being like, you have to do this. So we've got none of that. We've got no power to tell anyone what to do. And so these vineyards that are, this guy fenced, and so then his neighbor had to fence, and then his neighbor had to fence, and now there's no way for the deer to get through. At some point, you sort of need someone to step in and say there needs to be passage, but it's not necessarily something that the farms want to hear. It depends. It depends on the farm, right? Like if you're looking at conventional farms, our farmland is really expensive, and the agricultural land reserve really encourages farming, every square inch of it. So if you're having to take land out of production to create these migration corridors, that's a hard sell. So like you're paying your workers, you're paying your mortgage. It's difficult. So yeah.